investigate the child abuse, and it quickly announces that child abuse allegations have no substance. The Omaha World Herald and the New York Times, which are pretty big in covering this up, report that report about the allegations and law enforcement's response. So you have the New York Times pretty instrumental in this very early on, and the Omaha World Herald. So the toothpaste comes out of the tube. The Senate subcommittee gets 6 victims to come forward, and actually videotapes 4 of them, and they all corroborate each other. They corroborate each other. They talk about being flown around the country, and I've from the sealed grand jury documentation, I've got like 200 flight receipts that go all over, and all the kids, even though they're geographically separated except for Troy Bonner and Danny King, talk quite explicitly about perpetrators, where they were flown. They name the same people. They repeatedly corroborate each other. So, but federal and state law enforcement is still in paralysis. So then these senators show these videotapes to people within the state and federal judiciary. And finally, something happens. The toothpaste comes out of the tube. Now, toothpaste can be messy. So you've got these videotapes floating around with these kids talking about horrific tales of abuse by very upper echelon members of society, the rich and the powerful. And so the feds in the state have to put the toothpaste back in the tube. Does anybody know how toothpaste is put back in the tube once it's come out? Grand juries. In 1990, the state feds launched grand juries to investigate the child abuse allegations. Now, former chief judge of New York Court of Appeals famously quipped that prosecutors have so much control over grand juries that they can convince them to indict a ham sandwich. And these 2 grand juries turned out to be ham and Swiss on rye. The FBI coerces 2 of the kids to recant. All these kids were told, if you go on with this, buy FBI agents. And we're talking kids that have been molested since early adolescence and turned on to drugs. And when FBI agents come in and say, if you go on with this story, you're going to prison. We're going to put you away. So they start recanting. And then the federal grand jury quickly concludes that there's no child abuse. There's one kid, there's actually 2 kids, but there's one kid that's very credible who refuses to recant. And she's indicted on 8 counts of perjury. Her name is Alicia Owen. And she's been molested by a number of very powerful people within the judiciary and also within law enforcement. The state grand jury concludes the child abuse allegations are a, quote, carefully crafted hoax, and indicts Alicia Owen on 8 counts of perjury. So Alicia's looking at 300 years right now. And also Paul Benassi was one of the kids who wouldn't recant. And he was also indicted on perjury. And now the Omaha World Herald and also the New York Times trumpet the state's conclusion. I mean, the Omaha World Herald is really hammering away on the victims, really just kicking dirt on the victims. And then the New York Times, here's this little grand jury in Nebraska, and the New York Times has this huge story about how all these child abuse allegations are a carefully crafted hoax. But you know what's very strange? It never names who the hoaxsters are. Basically, it says a bunch of discombobulated young kids that have been addled on drugs concocted, these allegations that caused all these grand juries and concocted these stories about being flown all around the country. So, continuing on ham and Swiss, Alicia's first count of perjury includes statements she made about seeing Robert Wadman and then Omaha World Herald publisher Harold Anderson at pedophilic parties in the fall of 1988. Harold Anderson was the publisher of the Omaha World Herald, and it really gave scathing rebukes to the Franklin Committee, and also just raked the kids over the coals. And he was also a very good friend of George H.W. Bush. Owen's third count of perjury included a series of statements she made regarding accusations of Harold Anderson fondling an 11 or 12-year-old boy at a pedophilic party she attended. Owen's sixth count was based upon statements regarding Omaha Police Chief Robert Wadman inserting a barrel of a gun into her vagina. And Owen's eighth count of perjury consisted of her statements about performing oral sex on Douglas County District Court Judge Theodore Carlson as a 15-year-old. Paul Benassi's first count of perjury included statements he made about witnessing Alicia Owen and Omaha Police Department Robert Wadman having sexual relations on 2 occasions. And Paul Benassi's second count entailed accusations of him being tied up by George H.W. Bush friend and published in the Omaha World Herald, Harold Anderson, and burning his genitals with a cigarette and cutting him with a knife. So these kids, all these kids just were really sadistically abused, very sadistically abused. I mean, the upper echelon, at least some people within the upper echelon of power, were quite abusive to these children. Okay, so now we have the state versus Owen. Alicia is indicted on 8 state counts and 8 federal counts, but they're going to give him the state first. So she's looking at 160 years at the state, 20 years per indictment. But Alicia's trial represents much more than a simple case of perjury. Both a federal and a state grand jury have concluded that there's been no child abuse. So she has to be found guilty to sanctify those grand juries. If she's found innocent, those grand juries are going to be called into question. So her guilt is really needed. And now the state will pull out all stops and spare no expense to find Alicia Owen guilty of perjury. And in my book, I really delineate how corrupt her trial was. The prelude to her, the state investigator who interviewed these kids was flying back from Chicago, and I've got 5 sources in my book that said he found pictures. He was looking for pictures of these pedophilic orgies with the rich and powerful. He was flying back from Chicago, and his plane broke up in midair. There wasn't. And right before Alicia's trial, Alicia Owen's 17-year-old brother hangs himself. And Troy Bonner, one of the victims who testified against Alicia Owen, who was having second thoughts about, he testified against her at the grand jury. He was having second thoughts about testifying against her at her trial. His brother shot himself in the head playing Russian roulette. Now, neither the Owens nor the Bonners feel that their children committed suicide. And actually, none of the Caradoris feel that Gary Caradori's plane crash was a plane crash. So, Alicia Owen, this is kind of ironic. Henry Rosenthal was a big-time corporate lawyer. He had actually been a corporate lawyer for what would become Enron. And he was there, he accompanied Alicia to the grand jury, and the grand jury, which I acquired the sealed testimony of, and it was so corrupt, he just said, he charged like $300 an hour, and he said, you know, I'm going to represent her pro bono, and I'm going to work my ass off, and I'm going to make sure that, you know, they don't nail her. And so Rosenthal quickly discovers that Caradori's videotapes that were shown to the grand juries were doctored, okay? All the matching corroboration between the kids was taken out. And with the grand jurors saw just excerpts of these videotapes where the kids weren't corroborating each other. And so he tried to introduce that in her court, but the judge wouldn't let him. Incriminating evidence against Owens that wasn't introduced at her trial is planted in the jury room. And then FBI agents lined up against her. And it's very ironic that FBI agents would be lining up against her to say that she's lying, because the FBI concluded that there was no interstate pedophile network. But the FBI agents testified against her nonetheless. So her trial was 6 weeks. I believe it was the longest criminal trial in the history of Nebraska. It was the state of Nebraska put far more money into charging a girl that was 21 years old when she was indicted for perjury than it ever put into trying anybody for murder. And they carpet bombed her credibility. And her jury was split 7-5 when they started deliberating. It went into deliberations. Now, the first night of the first day that her jury was deliberating, now there's going to be a hung jury, pretty much, even though the state had pulled out all the stops. And you really have to read the book to see how corrupt her trial was and how corrupt these grand juries were. But her jury is split 7-5. So the night the grand jurors deliberate all day, and then they go home at night, and guess what? They watch CBS's 48 Hours. CBS really comes through. On the first day her jury starts deliberating Alicia's fate, 48 Hours broadcasts an episode entitled Accusing Prominent People of Sex Crimes. And one of the segments has Troy Bonner, former OPDG Robert Bobbin, and a prominent Omaha attorney trash Alicia Owen's credibility. And it makes repeated references to the grand jurors. And the 48 Hours reporter even admits that he's cognizant that her trial is going on now. I mean, talk about tainting a jury. And you have Dan Rather, who was heir apparent to Walter Cronkite as the most credible man in America, announcing this. So 48 Hours, and that kind of tips some jurors. And she's ultimately, after 3 days of deliberation, she's ultimately found guilty. Alicia is sentenced between 9 and 15 years in prison for perjury. A kid. Because they had to sentence her for perjury, and they had to give her a very stiff sentence, because all these kids have been told by the FBI agents, if you stick with this story, you're going down for perjury. So Alicia had to be, they had to make a case of her. And she spends nearly 2 years in solitary confinement. This shows you how additionally corrupt it is. Okay, now I showed you Paul Benassi, some of Paul Benassi's indictments, and I've showed you some of Alicia Owens' indictments, and they're basically the same. Okay, so after the state convicts Alicia by the skin of its teeth, they immediately drop all the charges against Paul Benassi because they didn't want to risk it. They just barely got Alicia, and they knew if they didn't get Paul, that Alicia